nearly 20 years ago, I was leading a group of teens on a trip to Washington, D.C. On Friday night, our group attended services at the historic Washington Hebrew congregation. I remember that night, they had a guest speaker. He was a member of their temple, a poet, and a Holocaust survivor. He did a reading of two of his poems. I don't remember the name of the first one. I only remember that it painfully detailed some of his experiences of torture and survival. But I remember vividly the name of the second poem. It was called Cholesterol. In this poem, he proclaimed that he was able to stave off and survive external threats. He had survived the most painful and harrowing chapter of our people's history. But with irony and humor, he explained how he was now defenseless against HDL and LDL and triglycerides. He survived the onslaught of the Nazis, but he was struggling in the battle for his own cardiac health. That message has stuck with me for all these years. The poet was speaking about his own internal struggles, but the message is applicable to the masses as well. On January 27th, 1838, a young lawyer gave a speech that would one day become legendary. While painting a picture of America's strengths and weaknesses, he explained that America enjoyed tremendous blessings, fertile soil, and democratic values. America was strong and defensible, and he saw no external threats anywhere on the horizon. Yet, he argued, there was another danger lurking. It was Americans themselves. He argued that no mortal threat could come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and its finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. The name of that prophetic young lawyer was Abraham Lincoln. For Abraham Lincoln, just like his namesake, our forefather Abraham in the book of Genesis, who urged God to save the righteous of all nations, it was clear that a nation could only be as strong as its acceptance of all its citizens. The strength of a society, most especially a democracy, is fundamentally tied to its willingness to treat minorities with the same respect that it treats the majority. Unfortunately, from time immemorial, majority populations have taken their hardships and difficulties out on the minorities in their midst. We Jews have been the brunt of this warped strategy for millennia. In 1882, the assassination of Tsar Alexander II unleashed a wave of pogroms that spread throughout the Russian Empire. Jews who had nothing to do with the assassination were blamed en masse for Alexander's death. They were blamed by those who owed them money. They were blamed by the government, who had no real answers for their citizens' problems, and they were an easy target. In Germany, 50 years later, history repeated itself. The Jewish population of Germany in 1933 totaled 505,000 people, out of a total population of 67 million Germans. They made up less than 1% of the German people. Yet with targeted and unceasing propaganda, the Nazis were able to convince 99% of the German people that the other 1% caused their defeat in World War I, the destruction of their economy, and rabid strife throughout their entire society. This is something that is impossible for the rational person to believe. But it's a lot easier to sell than real solutions to difficult problems. In America, we too are not strangers to this faulty strategy. Though our country sees itself as the leader of the free world, America has fallen prey to the temptation of blaming real problems on vulnerable minorities. Today we see the rise of radical elements in America who subscribe to this ideology. They are reopening our nation's old wounds and pouring salt in them. 60 years after the famous March on Washington and Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, when we would have thought that we would be well on our way to the fulfillment of that dream, we see racial and ethnic tensions bubbling over the surface. The U.S. News and World Report ranks countries according to their level of racial equality. If this were the 1960s, a low ranking would not surprise us. But I was dismayed to see that in the most recent rankings, the U.S. is ranked 65th, falling behind countries like Turkey, Hungary, and China. For an increasingly relevant swath of our country, instead of recognizing that diversity is our country's greatest asset, they see it as our Achilles heel. And what they really hate is when minority success overshadows their own lack of advancement. The truth is, according to Forbes magazine, that 40% of the Nobel Prizes won by Americans in chemistry, medicine, and physics since 2000 have been awarded to immigrants. Yet there is a willing audience interested in hearing how those same immigrants are the cause of all of our nation's ills. Every poll that monitors racism, anti-Semitism, and extremism, from the Pew Report to the research of the AJC and the ADL, everyone will tell you that in the last 6 years, intolerance and hatred of minorities is on the rise. But we don't need the polls to tell us what we already know. We live in a state where legislation targets the LGBTQ community in ways we thought were decades behind us. We live in a world where hate groups mobilize in the murky world of the internet and then spread their filthy vitriol to our neighborhoods and other sizable Jewish populations in the country. What is so scary, what makes us wonder what is happening in our country, is the rate at which such despicable beliefs are spreading. This is nothing new. I've been talking about this on the High Holy Days for years already. You've probably heard this exact same sermon. But today, what is different in my opinion is how we need to respond and how we are responding. There are no definitive numbers, but based on Pew Research and the ADL results, we can say that the number of Americans who harbor xenophobic views is somewhere around 20%. At the same time, there is a mirror equal number of Americans who support freedom and equality for everyone. Just as there are 20% of Americans who would support policies, candidates, and laws that favor the majority to the detriment of the minority, there's an opposite 20% who would protest these policies with all of their might. The battle today that we must confront is not how do we convince the 20% that is full of hatred to be better people. The battle, I believe, and the battle for the soul of our nation is entirely dependent on the 60% in the middle. These are the bystanders who simply aren't paying attention. They are Americans who are going about their lives, tending to their careers, raising their families, and not wasting time persecuting others. Racism and xenophobia are not their issue. They would never draw a swastika on a building or hang anti-Semitic banners from highway overpasses. They won't blanket our neighborhoods with anti-Semitic flyers, and they won't attend anti-Israel demonstrations. They're the bystanders. They don't participate. But the problem with this 60% who remain on the sidelines is that they won't stand up for the persecuted either. It isn't their issue. And if they aren't the ones being persecuted, it would never occur to them to get involved. Once again, we can look to our people's own history to make sense of the concept of the bystander. Famed author and Holocaust survivor Primo Levi wrote, "In Hitler's Germany, particular code was widespread. Those who knew did not talk. Those who did not know did not ask questions. Those who did ask questions received no answers. In this way, the typical German citizen won and defended his ignorance, which seemed to him sufficient justification of his adherence to Nazism." For 60% of the American public, ignorance is bliss. But for the Jew, it is not. Every year at our Passover Seders, we confront those among us who do not associate themselves with what is right in society. Every year at the Seder, we look closely into the eyes of the one who does not see the ills of society as his problem. At the Seder, we call this character the wicked child. He is the one who says, "What does all of this mean to you?" He is the one who excludes himself from any interest or responsibility in our age-old endeavor of removing evil from our midst. Since he's not the one being persecuted, he doesn't identify with the downtrodden. Because he interprets no threats to his own well-being, he's not stirred by the dangers that threaten those around him. Concerning the wicked child, the Haggadah instructs that when he says, "What does all of this mean to you?" we are supposed to blunt his teeth. We're supposed to commit a violent act that punishes him for his apathy. The rabbis, however, explain that the force of this phrase, "blunt his teeth," is not to be taken literally. Instead, they teach that blunting the teeth refers to scraping away the rough exterior of the child to bring out the goodness that lies beneath. It is not at all difficult to develop a callous exterior to suffering. Yet our tradition believes that underneath these layers of indifference lies a pure and innocent soul, eager to fight and to scratch and to claw for the rights of all people, for equality, for the bells of justice to ring loudly, as Dr. King said, from every village and every hamlet, from every state and from every city. For so many members of our society, the routine of daily life overshadows the moral responsibility of caring for others, especially those who are not well positioned to defend themselves. Our Haggadah challenges us not to accept the unconcerned, not to allow them to shirk their responsibility to heed the call of the oppressed. Rather, we are commanded to blunt the teeth of the unmoved, to urge them to join the side of the 20% of Americans who seek real answers to our problems and never succumb or tolerate the scapegoating of the few for the problems of the many. We can be certain that the other side, the evil 20%, they're looking to grow. And they're making inroads. And they have an easy product to sell. You have problems, they say? Well, we have someone to blame them on. You aren't happy with your standing in society? We will show you who has taken your rightful place in this country and is leaving you behind. And their corrupt and abhorrent propaganda is unceasing. They're becoming more sophisticated. They are gathering followers. They're spreading their venom online in the streets, and they are trying to win as many of the 60% of bystanders to their side of the spectrum. And as the head of the ADL, Jonathan Greenblatt, explains, it can happen in the blink of an eye. In 1928, the Nazi Party earned 2.63% of the vote in the federal election. In 1933, just 5 years later, that figure rose to 43.91%. Consider what happened not too long ago in England, a country where you would think a Jewish community could live in relative peace and tranquility. 40% of the Jewish population in England said that they were prepared to leave the country if Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party would have succeeded in the election. It can happen overnight. It happens when the fight for the support of the uncommitted bystanders is lost. If there is one thing that we have learned here at Temple Beth Am through our unbiased initiative, is that the days of sitting around and lamenting anti-Semitism and the rise of extremism with each other is over. The time has come for all of us to reach out to the broader community, to create partnerships, and enlist allies. About a year ago, I had a meeting with a pastor from Cooper City. I told him that I could use his help. He was a bit taken aback and wondered what could he possibly do for me. I told him that when an anti-Semitic attack happens and our community comes to protest, it falls on deaf ears. However, if God forbid an anti-Semitic incident occurred in your neighborhood and you and your congregation showed up to protest, and you would say that the perpetrators of such hatred would not be tolerated in your backyard, the difference in impact would be seismic. He said such a thing never occurred to him. I didn't have to blunt his teeth. I just had to suggest that we could use his help. On Rosh Hashanah, I asked you to commit to coming to Shabbat services 8 times a year. It turns out, according to my numbers, that even with that major commitment, that still leaves you 357 days of the year left. If you're really interested in making a difference in Miami, if you're tired of feeling helpless as levels of anti-Semitism rise around us, then you should join the efforts of those of us who are already signed on to our unbiased initiative. We will help you have the real conversations with our non-Jewish neighbors. We are going out to meet the 60% in our community that is not attuned to these issues. We are learning about their stories and sharing our story with them. If we are going to make a real difference in our community, this is the path that we must forge. The battle for the soul of our country will be fought in the middle ground. And the stakes are astronomical. If we fail, if the 20% of America that subscribes to neo-Nazi ideology in one form or another is successful in attracting 30.1% of the population to their side, then America will be doomed to the same fate as other failed societies who offered their populations nothing other than scapegoated sacrificial lambs. This, though, cannot be the fate of our great country. We have come too far, and our promise is too bright to let self-inflicted wounds tear us apart. The hate mongers with the easy answers for the weak-minded will always crawl beneath the surface. Over the last few years, we have seen them inch closer toward the mainstream. Slowly but surely, they are trying to increase from 20% to 21%, to 25%, to 30%, and so on and so on. Today, on this holiest of days, I dream of a country where we make ourselves heard to the 60% of Americans whose pure souls are lying dormant underneath hardened and stubborn exteriors. Today, I'm praying for the day when our 20% becomes 80%, when the souls of the disinterested are finally aroused and won over by the power of morality and righteousness, when an army of 80% of people of goodwill have the strength and the ethical mandate to pulverize the cowardly haters among us. We who seek equality and freedom for all in this country, we who have found a home on these shores that admires the tenets of our faith and the values of our ethics, must continue to defy our enemies and reach out to our neighbors. 60 years ago, before he ascended the dais to enthrall a nation with his "I Have a Dream" speech, Martin Luther King invited his friend, Rabbi Joachim Prinz, to speak before him. On that historic day, Rabbi Prinz told the crowd, "When I was the rabbi of the Jewish community in Berlin under the Hitler regime, I learned many things. The most important thing that I learned under those tragic circumstances was that bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problem. The most urgent, the most disgraceful, the most shameful, and the most tragic problem is silence. A great people who had created a great civilization had become a nation of silent onlookers. They remained silent in the face of hate, in the face of brutality, and in the face of murder." Rabbi Prince's words still ring in our ears. Let us not waste our breath with the slime of society. Instead, let us set a course for those who ask, what does all of this mean to you? And when we encounter this choir of indifference, let us be prepared to answer like we do every year at our Passover Seders. It's not just what it means to me. It's also what it means to you. It's what it means to all of us, to our children, to our future, to the United States of America. These are the stakes of the battle we must wage. This must be the battle hymn cry if we expect to one day say, Hashta Avdei, L'shana haba b'nei chorin. This year we are enslaved. Next year we will be free. Amen.